In this podcast, I'm sharing my passion and curiosity for soft robotics, where we share inspiring stories about the work we do and how we can push the limit. I am Mara Dwini, and this is Soft Robotics Podcast. I'd like to ask you first, how would you like to define who you are for the audience maybe first time listening to you? How would you like to define yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm on the faculty here at Northwestern University. My home department, that is material science and engineering, although I have joint appointments in biomedical engineering and neurological surgery. So, I run a large research group here, kind of active mainly at the boundary between engineering and medicine. So it's a pleasure to participate in this podcast. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask you first, based on your work, first of all, when you look to nature, evolution, what's something you think in terms of sensing or designing material in human or maybe something inspired you, still very challenging for us now in this intersection between material science and engineering? It's hard to design or understand how it works. If you notice something like that.
Yeah, so a large fraction of our research focuses on the development of new classes of devices that can monitor various aspects of biological systems, and that could range from cell cultures to small 3D tissue constructs to animal models of various biological processes for fundamental research, but also translating to use with human patients to address unmet needs in clinical health care. So really spanning that entire wide range. I think our core competency is in electronic material science, and in thinking about those kinds of applications, we're interested in developing materials for electronic, optoelectronic, microfluidic, microelectrical mechanical systems that adopt geometries and sets of mechanical properties that are naturally compatible with soft tissues that one encounters in the biological world. And so that's kind of a radical departure from the sort of rigid, planar, semiconductor wafer-based technologies that exist today in microsystems engineering. And so there are tremendous opportunities for the development of new materials, but also in the development of new ways to combine old materials with new materials. So hard materials with soft materials, for example, in kind of a hybrid heterogeneous integration type of strategy. And so that's kind of the centroid of our work is around the material science and the mechanics of materials and interface science and so on. But in order to have a real impact, on biological research or human health care, you need to work kind of at the system level. So not just the development of the base materials and a fundamental scientific understanding of those materials, but really developing competencies to weave those materials into novel classes of devices, and then not even just isolated devices, but devices that interconnect with one another to build functional systems that can be handed off to our collaborators in neuroscience research, for example, or can be deployed on patients through the collaborations that we have across our medical complex here in Chicago. And so the consequence is, our programs are highly interdisciplinary, and our core is in material science, but we feather in expertise in electrical engineering and computer science engineering, data analytics, manufacturing science, and try to bring it all together in such a way that we can connect our new materials innovations to ultimate needs and requirements, so that we are positioned well to contribute not only to the academic kind of scientific literature, but where the ideas make sense and there's a good intersection with unmet needs, we can begin to think about translation and broader impact and commercialization and things of that sort. So that's the sort of research team that we've tried to assemble over the years, and I think we've been able to do a reasonably competent job of that.
I'm curious to ask you about the design. When you speak about weaving different classes of material, for example, soft and hard, how do you see maybe the morphology or architecture, or maybe what could, from your experience, more significant in designing so that you can get really interesting features, and how really changing geometry can really significantly change the behavior of the material?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll just take a step back before answering that question specifically. I mean, if you think about, let's say, a silicon integrated circuit, it's a spectacularly sophisticated piece of technology, but in all commercial forms that exist today and have existed historically, that technology has been built on the rigid planar surface of a silicon wafer. And that's a great substrate for lots of different applications. You end up with microchips, and they call them chips because of the mechanics and the geometry. But if you want to integrate that sort of technology with soft, time dynamic, moving, curvilinear surfaces or volumetric spaces of living tissues, the mechanics is sort of all wrong, and the geometry kind of doesn't make sense. And so you really have to think about that challenge, from the standpoint of the constituent materials. Why does an integrated circuit have the properties that it does? Is partly because the silicon itself and many of the other functional materials in that system are rigid and brittle, and they're most easily processed in planar forms, and that's the consequence. And so you think about it, how do you kind of reformulate that technology without losing, much in terms of the sophistication and the operational capabilities to look more like biology? And one strategy would be to just move away from silicon, move away from silicon dioxide, move away from copper, and think about maybe conducting polymers or semiconducting polymers or 2D materials or graphene or carbon nanotubes, and then build a whole new, portfolio of electronic materials and develop manufacturing approaches that allow you to manipulate those materials and develop an entirely new technology base where the goal would be to overcome these sort of highly non-ideal geometric and mechanical characteristics that characterize silicon integrated circuits. That's one way to go, and we spent a lot of time exploring that pathway to this end goal of biocompatible electronics. And I think there are a number of research groups around the world who are doing great work along those lines. The other direction, and I think this is where your question is really oriented, is to think about how you can use silicon or use silicon dioxide, all sorts of well-established electronic materials, gallium arsenide, gallium nitride, and so on, but integrate them in a hybrid way with soft materials, so that those brittle hard materials develop sort of effective soft characteristics at the system level. So it's still the same brittle hard materials, but you've embedded them in soft elastomers, and you've configured them in a geometric fashion so that you can affect kind of an end-to-end stretchability with a low modulus response to forces that lead to this kind of soft biocompatible structure. And so that's a separate, different sort of conceptual pathway to the same endpoint. And it's really that second strategy that's worked out best for us anyway. We're able to produce devices that offer realistic levels of function, unique capabilities that can't be reproduced any other way. And so I guess the centroid of our activity is in that second route. We still are interested in completely novel materials, but I think like taking existing materials and putting them together in interesting ways, and using, say, buckling mechanics would be one very simple example of how you do this. So you can take very thin strips of silicon, for example, and by making the silicon extremely thin relative to the thickness, let's say, of a silicon wafer, so moving from a thickness of 1 millimeter to maybe a thickness of 10 nanometers, there's a tremendous reduction in the bending stiffness as a result of that reduction in thickness. And that's pretty simple, elementary bending mechanics. Is sort of intuitive how that works. And so thin silicon becomes flexible. So now you can put that thin silicon on a sheet of plastic. You can make a very high performance, flexible integrated circuit. For biology, you need more than just the ability to flex. You also need a capacity to stretch, which is a different type of mechanics. But you can also achieve that by playing with the geometry. So you can take these thin strips of silicon, you can bond them to an underlying soft elastomer substrate, but you don't bond them just in a flat geometry. You bond them in kind of a wavy shape. And once you've done that, now you have a hard, soft material composite structure where applied force can lead to an overall stretching of that integrated system, but in a way that doesn't lead to fracture-inducing strains in the silicon itself, because that wave structure can now change to accommodate in-plane deformation by trading off out-of-plane displacement. So the amplitudes of those wave structures go down when you stretch that system in a way that, again, reproduces or provides kind of an end-to-end stretchability, but in a manner that doesn't impart significant strains in the silicon itself. So that would be like the simplest example of how you can kind of use geometry, use principles of mechanical engineering, buckling mechanics, hard, soft materials to like kind of cleverly take what works well in conventional electronics technology and reformulate it and adapt it into these soft biocompatible forms. That would be the simplest example. All kinds of different ideas in origami and kirigami, and you're playing with sort of motions in a way that creates like an effective, I guess, like a mechanical metamaterial, I guess is one way you could think about it. So you can achieve not only low modulus with linear elastic response, but you can even engineer in sort of J-shaped stress strain behaviors that are very similar to those that you see in the biological world by getting a little bit more sophisticated and exploiting in-plane serpentine design. So you're doing out-of-plane buckling, but also in-plane buckling and all sorts of engineering elaborations of those basic ideas. So it turns out to be a really robust, rich direction for research, thinking about how to do some of those things. But once you come up with solutions, they're immediately applicable, not just to silicon integrated circuits, but almost every class of planar microsystem technology that exists today, and applicable for any class of material, not just silicon, but really any material, inorganic or organic or otherwise. And so for us, that's been a very productive way to go. And it really is the dominating design strategy for almost everything that we're doing in soft electronics these days.
Excellent. So I'm curious to ask you, when you look to the material part and selection of the classes of material for designing, for example, sensing here, and the geometry and mechanics, how do you see this kind of relationship here? Which one is more dominant, do you believe? Currently speaking, you think that's so significant so that we can push the design limitation, for example? Is it the mechanics, geometry, materials part? Which one? Or maybe something else? Yeah.
It's pretty much everything taken together, I would say. You need to use every tool in your toolbox. I mean, I think one maybe deficiency of certain, research approaches is to become too fixated on one aspect of the overall system design. Laser focus on mechanics alone is not going to solve the problem. You can't solve it just with new materials either, and you really have to be flexible in your thinking and be willing to combine everything together. It's sort of this interdisciplinary approach. I mean, again, my core expertise is in materials science, but we appreciate that mechanics design is of critical importance in all of these types of efforts. And so we collaborate very closely with top groups in mechanical engineering, both experimental and theoretical groups in mechanical engineering. And Professor Yonggang Huang here at Northwestern is an example of a long-time collaborator that we've had in this space. And he has the ability to develop analytical scaling forms to help us understand the underlying physics so that we can more effectively optimize the design choices. He also does system level computational simulations of the mechanics of these hard soft structures. So you go about designing a system, you have to think about not only the intrinsic properties of the materials, obviously, but you also have to think about how you put those materials together in devices, how you design circuits. That's all pretty much conventional to all kinds of electronic systems. But now you have to think about mechanics design right along with circuit design, because it's the layout of the circuit elements that determines the function, but it's also, determining the effective mechanics, like how far you can stretch these types of devices before something breaks, for example, or what kind of force you have to apply to induce a certain deformation. And you have to design into the system from the standpoint of the underlying physics and the engineering choices such that the overall platform is providing the function you want, but also mechanically matched to the point of integration, whether that's the skin or the brain or the cardiac system, kidney, liver, lung, diaphragm, all sorts of places across the biology and the animal models or human subjects where we've explored integration. So I guess my answer, is to think about everything. Don't become too fixated on one particular aspect, because all of these different components, materials, mechanics, electrical engineering, they're separate knobs in a sense, and you want to be able to manipulate as many knobs as possible, to get you to the end point and to allow for the development of systems that meet a whole myriad of requirements, typically very, very challenging set of requirements. And so you have to think about everything. I would make the other comment maybe that the materials diversity is also an important consideration here, and maybe I would emphasize materials over some of the other aspects, just maybe being a materials scientist. But if you want to think about body integrated electronics, so you can think about it as like two components to the overall system. One is kind of the supporting electronics that's providing the radio frequency communication, for example, or the A to D functionality, or the sampling, the multiplex addressing capabilities, or amplification, all kinds of like back end stuff that's essential. But then the forward-facing materials are those that actually make physical contact and are physically or optically engaged directly with living tissues. And there are probably broader sets of opportunities for new materials. Let's say materials that are not found in silicon integrated circuits as they exist today. It's really that interface layer, the transduction layer, that's allowing for the communication between the electronics and the optoelectronics and the adjacent contacting biology. And there, you need to think about materials that it can engage at a molecular level to monitor biochemical markers of health, for example, and basically provide currency exchange between, biochemistry and ionic flows and so on that are governing the behavior of the biology, and the flow of electrons and photons, which are kind of dominating the function of that kind of electronic backplane component of the system. So there are different material challenges in different aspects of these overall devices, and bringing all of those materials together in a robust single system is where there are tremendous research opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I guess to ask you in that case about the design and the scope of the material, maybe into the mechanics and also geometry, and maybe general work. Do you think intuitive design is the first approach? Because sometimes there's a problem, I think, in materials, this kind of structure, you don't understand how it can be solved analytically, for example. It's so complex, but intuitively it make a lot of sense. I don't know if you have experience, you just think about, let's go for intuitive design and the first step. Do you have any moment like that and was like, or maybe design was counterintuitive or surprising? Because sometimes it happens.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that most of the designs that we end up with are fairly intuitive at some level. That's usually not good enough, to do really rigorous engineering optimization and to sort of identify the best design parameters and so on. But it does provide a good starting point. You can kind of guess at what kind of layout and what types of materials are going to work together. You have to think about interface mechanics tend to be a dominating consideration, and in many cases those aspects of these systems can't be modeled effectively because some of the surface chemistry is not well known. And in many cases as well, you have a pretty good idea of the constitutive properties of the materials, but they depend on processing history and other aspects that are sometimes difficult to quantify. But I think an empirical kind of intuitive approach is a good starting point, in many of these cases, but it can't be the end point. So that's why, analytical and computational modeling is so important, because it can take you from that initial guess at a optimized design and then help to refine it. And sometimes those refinements are subtle, just changing the radius of curvature of a particular serpentine feature, or moving a silicon component from one place to another to avoid a stress concentration, for example. And many of those kinds of subtleties are not immediately apparent. They're not intuitive, but they can be captured by modeling. I'll give you one example of something that for me was non-intuitive and was sort of revealed by analytical modeling, and that has to do with relatively recent effort for us, which is involving the addition of winged flight to small-scale microsystems technologies, so very, very small integrated circuit chips, radios, digital biosensors, and so on, where our goal is to take some of our body-integrated sensor technologies and reformulate them or adapt them for application in environmental monitoring. Let's say monitoring the characteristics of the atmosphere, or properties of groundwater, for example, or the soil. And in thinking about that, one big challenge is how do you disperse small devices over large areas and volumes. How do you go from just manually placing devices at different places on the body to deploying those devices at scales of like a cubic mile or something like that, if you want to monitor the atmosphere. And we thought about different strategies for doing that. And one scheme that's particularly appealing for us is to use bio-inspired ideas that evolution has arrived at for seed dispersal in the plant world. Thinking about a microchip as something you want to disperse in conceptually the same way that a tree wants to disperse genetic material, that kind of thing. And thinking about how maple seeds are designed to develop this kind of helicopter-like motion during a free fall, and in such a way that the terminal velocities are reduced to extend the engagement of the seed with patterns of airflow, wind that can aid in the dispersal. And so we've developed ways to add very tiny wings to microchip technologies, and we can design those wings at least as a starting point with this kind of intuitive design approach. You think about like how the wings need to be configured to create this helicopter-like motion. In those kinds of, and that's a reasonable starting point. It doesn't get you to the ultimate optimized flight dynamics, but it is a good starting point. But the other consideration in those kinds of devices is you want them to be as low cost as possible so that you can economically think realistically about deploying thousands of devices. So that means for any kind of semiconductor device technology, you want to make the devices as small as possible because the cost is in many cases scaling with the overall size. And so you want to make passive flyer structures inspired by wind dispersed seeds, but at size scales that are much smaller than seeds, much smaller than a maple seed. And then the question is like, how small can you go? And where does the scaling sort of break down? And we have ways to create these three-dimensional wing structures and add them to an integrated circuit chip, for example, at any length scale, almost any length scale. So submicron, we can even generate wings at that scale. But what turned out to be the case, and this is maybe a little bit intuitive, non-intuitive at the time, but maybe if you think about it, maybe it does make sense, which is that you can achieve this kind of controlled helicopter type flight dynamics for certain size scales, but below a particular length scale, everything just drops like a sphere. And there's very little aerodynamic advantage to adding wings when the overall structure size is less than about 1 millimeter. And we wouldn't have, I wouldn't have immediately guessed that, but that was something that came as a result of a combined effort in experimental studies using wind tunnels and computational modeling to capture, the aerodynamics of how these wings engage with air during free fall at these very small size scales. And that was maybe a little bit surprising, something that came up fairly recently in a new project area for us.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm curious to ask you again about the design in that case. I think about physical intelligence, because I think it's very interesting how maybe you aspire to have fast and cheap and also less computation. And I guess ask you in that case how you leverage this kind of intrinsic feature of the material so that you can reduce this complexity of computation and achieving maybe some sort of physical intelligence. And I think that's an interesting part, maybe if you can elaborate on that, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting direction. It's certainly a well-populated area in material science research. I guess if you're referring to physical intelligence as intelligence that's kind of built into the material structure itself, I think that's really interesting. We have a large multi-university program in 3D kind of functional responsive materials where you don't have well-defined device components that's controlling the response of a system. It's just embedded in the chemistry and in the material structure, and it sort of automatically, almost smart material maybe is a little bit dated as a terminology, but something, with that sort of concept, guiding the design choices and the research. So it's interesting. We have the ability to combine now, electronics with microfluidics, with optoelectronics, and you can begin to think about those kind of highly integrated types of systems almost as a complex kind of living material structure in a sense. And the question is, how do you create sort of responsiveness and some kind of embedded intelligence and the ability to sense and respond and actuate in complex ways. And so I guess we're, in terms of like a realistic technology that begins to embed some of those ideas. I'll come back to the environmental sensors and maybe some of our sweat microfluidic devices as well. But the wing structures that we add to these microchips are typically made out of polymer materials, and we like environmentally degradable materials as well. As you imagine, distributing tens of thousands of devices across an area, you don't want to have to go and recover each one, and you also don't want to create electronic waste streams that could be hazardous. You have to think about all of the constituent materials being ultimately environmentally degradable, and so we use polymers for the wings. We try to adapt existing electronic materials to the extent possible to support this kind of degradability as a key characteristic. But into the wings themselves, we can integrate colorimetric chemical reagents that respond through a color change to a characteristic of interest in the environment. And that could be temperature or UV exposure or particulate pollution or heavy metal contamination in groundwater or pH or other kinds of species that one is interested in tracking. And so I suppose in a very primitive way that begins to move toward kind of a physically intelligent system. And right now we're using high resolution digital image capture technology to do the color readout as a form of wireless communication, I suppose. But you could also envision, a spectroscopic capability, integrated in the chip component of these flying microsystems that would be able to maybe use ambient light to read out the color change and then transmit that information wirelessly as a more advanced scheme of that very sort. So, I guess that would be a really simple example of how you can build responsive materials, maybe co-integrate responsive materials with functional components of a hybrid microsystem. It's not fully realizing that grander vision of physical intelligence, but maybe a simple step in that direction.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I've just asked you again about when you try to achieve certain features, for example, maybe the sensing part, there's different maybe categories here you have to consider in design, and sometimes there's a trade-off between the mechanical performance, for example, and the accuracy. I'm curious if there's something you notice, maybe still limitation about the trade-off, the design of material, or how we can push the limit here. Maybe also, for example, in human body, for example, you also speak about how can this kind of electronics maybe dissolve it over the lifetime. So when you look to the space of this kind of features, you think that's maybe still so challenging trade-off here, or I'm curious about the trade-offs here in that part.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are quite significant challenges that remain. And I think a lot of those challenges have to do with the fact that there's a lot that's unknown about biology and how living systems respond to man-made technologies, and how does that integration work, and what is the interface between these abiotic systems with the biotic world. What does that look like? And so that's a big problem. I mean, I think especially for your devices that implant into the body and need to maintain stable operation over long periods of time. So, and those periods of time could be measured in decades if you're talking about a device that's designed to last the life of the patient. And so, what's going on over that incredibly long time frame? You have a device that's immersed in warm saline solution essentially for, say 50 years or something, 30 years, and that represents, achieving stable operation under those conditions represents an extremely daunting materials challenge. But then you have layered on top of that challenge the fact that in a lot of cases, the immune system, of the biological, the living organism is activated to break down your device and to accelerate the degradation of the materials. And so you have an integrated system where one of those systems is actively attacking the other, unless you do something very clever to avoid that. And so that kind of response, and it could be as benign as the formation of a fibrotic tissue capsule around the device can have a profound effect on that measurement interface, or the interface that's defining a therapeutic function supported by the device. And so I think it's an academic area for research. I mean, in some ways that makes it even more appealing, because there's a lot of discovery that needs to happen around fundamental questions around how the biology is working, and then that feeds back to choices and challenges in materials development and overall device design. And so if you think about biocompatibility and stable operation in that broader context, you have to think certainly about the chemical compounds that make up your device. So you have to think about things at the intrinsic materials level, but compatibility and immune reactions can also be triggered by mismatch between the mechanical properties of the device and the surrounding tissue, or the geometry. So you have to think about all these different aspects, and it's intrinsically an experimental science, because you don't know the operating principles, all of the basic aspects of the biology, and so you have to explore and do experiments and look at the reactions, and take those data and try to extract insights that can help guide design choices for other types of devices. So I think there are tremendous challenges at that level. The other question is how do you do sensing beyond physical characteristics? So I think existing microsystems can do extremely well measuring things like optical absorption, or temperature, or strain, or acoustic responses, and biopotential. All of that stuff works really well. But how do you measure neurotransmitters, for example? How do you measure subtle fluctuations in the concentration of calcium, for example, if you're studying neural processes? I think that's where there are tremendous frontiers in material science, in developing those kinds of biochemical sensors, again, with the additional requirement around stable operation for long periods of time. Extremely challenging, but I think extremely rewarding areas of research, because successful outcomes could have profound impacts on the way that we study living systems, and ultimately the way that we do healthcare, and the way that we treat human patients to improve outcomes and ultimately reduce costs as well. So there's tremendous outcomes for successful efforts. There's deep and exciting basic scientific questions that need to be answered. And I think it's for a lot of these reasons that the centroid of our overall research programs are kind of in this area. It's just very rich and deep from an academic standpoint, but with all sorts of broader impacts that would flow from successful efforts.
Right. Now, just to skill again in that part, maybe if we want to push the limits here, integrate living system with artificial material. How do you see the integration possibly that we're using the living material to adapt with artificial one?
Yeah, so I think there's a fair amount of work, and not just in academic circles, but now more and more in startup companies, and I think traditional biomedical device technology companies are also expanding the range of capabilities. But if you look, I think most or all devices either kind of integrate with the surfaces of tissues. So sheets of electrodes, for example, that reside on the surface of the brain would be a good example, or different devices that interface with the surface of the skin. That's fine. Then you have other classes of devices that interface at point locations in the depths of tissues. So penetrating probes, so deep brain stimulators, would be a good example of that, or cochlear implants, so sort of probe style geometries, typically with one or a small countable number of active interface points, typically electrodes, but into the future you can imagine LEDs or other or chemical sensors, other kinds of sensors. So it's like surfaces or linear collections of devices that probe down into the depths of tissues. I think an exciting frontier, maybe impossible, but it's one that we like to think about at least, is a different modality where the devices would be distributed through a volumetric space, because just residing on the surface of the brain, you're missing all of the activity that's happening down into the depth. If you have a probe, you get some depth information, but you're losing the surface and you're losing the adjacent volumes as well. And so, how do you do kind of 3D integration where devices are distributed throughout that volumetric space and are engaging at a qualitatively deeper level than anything is possible from surfaces or point contacts in selected regions into the depth. So I would say that's kind of like a grand challenge. Maybe there isn't a solution, but it's one that we like to think about. And from the standpoint of the engineering science, the corresponding challenge is how do you develop classes of electronics or optoelectronic devices that are configured in an open 3D mesh-like architecture, much like, a neural network in the brain, or, a system of blood vessels, that are permeating a 3D space by necessity for delivery of nutrients and removal of waste. How do you begin to do that in a circuit technology? And I think we've kind of worked that problem over the years, and I think we kind of know how to do that. Basically, take a planar integrated circuit and configure the system so that we can, in a deterministic and controlled way, cause the active elements of that circuit to move up out of the plane in a series of coordinated translational and rotational motions to form kind of an open 3D network type geometry that in principle can engage over that 3D space. And that's something we've been working on for a while, and the same techniques actually sort of recast are used to form these wing structures for these dispersed microchips that I was talking about before. So I think we have a pretty good handle on how to do the 3D. We do not know how to do the integration, however. Like, how do you take a preformed, network mesh of 3D electronics with plenty of open space where cells could reside and engage, across that volume, embedded in it. But how do you get it into, a living system without, inducing tremendous amount of damage during that integration? And maybe the answer is you simply grow the tissue around the scaffold. It's an active electronic scaffold now. Maybe you seed it with cells and you grow your organism around that structure. So the structure is forming like a skeleton, but also an active, 3D interface to the living tissue that results from that growth. So I would say it's still sort of an area we're trying to figure things out, but a direction maybe for the future. That would be one comment that I would make. The other one, kind of related to that. Again, thinking about 3D integration, I feel like optical interfaces to living systems are going to be the most powerful way for bidirectional communication and engagement with a 3D living tissue, just because you can project and image and manipulate photons at distances in ways that are impossible with electrons. And so there's tremendous activity in the biological community to develop fluorescent tags of various sorts that are expressed through genetic modifications of targeted cells. And so they create the sensors, the optical sensors themselves. The natural cellular processes do that. And then the readout just involves projecting photons down into the depth of tissues that have been genetically modified in that way to create fluorescence that can then be imaged. And so then you can start to do 3D in that fashion. The limitation is really associated with the finite penetration depth of photons due to scattering and absorption by the tissue. And so ultimately there may be a hybrid approach where you have some kind of limited 3D, let's say, photonic system, but then the last mile or whatever is of engagement with the tissue is dictated by projection of photons into a depth. And so it would reduce then the density of that 3D network that you would need in order to support full volumetric engagement with the tissue. So probably an optical approach combined with a 3D hardware infrastructure for emitting and collecting and imaging photons. Maybe something like that would represent an ultimate solution. But we'll see. I think it's very much an open area. Tremendous opportunities for new ideas, creative strategies, new materials, and so on. So that's an area we find pretty exciting.
So since we're close to the end, I have a few questions. Maybe the first one comes to the redundancy or scenario of failure for sensing in such really critical situation like the patient here. How do you imagine design sensors like maybe more redundant or adapt to uncertainty like failure, damage? This scenario, how do you imagine the capability of redundancy here?
Well, couple of things I would say, in response to that question. One is that we're very interested in devices that actually don't need to last forever, that are designed to monitor or provide a therapy in the context of a transient biological process, such as wound healing. And so in those instances, we have classes of materials, electronic, photonic materials, battery materials, for example, that are bioresorbable. So they dissolve in biofluids to biocompatible end products. And so we can develop, let's say, and we published very recently a cardiac pacemaker, a wireless pacemaker that we constructed out of materials that are bioresorbable. And so there you really need function only for a couple of weeks during a critical risk period following a cardiac surgery. And so you'd like to be able to pace the heart, to the extent that that's needed as the patient recovers. That's the idea. And then after the patient has recovered, you don't need the pacing functionality anymore. And so you'd like to design the device to just melt away and disappear to avoid what would otherwise be a requirement for a secondary surgical extraction procedure. And so that would be my first answer, which is that you don't need long-term stability in all use cases of clinical relevance. And so this whole idea of bioresorbable or transient electronics is very exciting as a engineering form of medicine, I guess is the way you could conceptually think about it. At some level, it's a resorbable suture, but it's actually active electronic device, and it could really complement in a powerful way more traditional pharmacological approaches. But maybe to more the point of your question, if you want a device that's needs to operate for long periods of time, again, ultimately, kind of life of the patient would be an example of that. I think redundancy is probably the only way to address the practical engineering reality that failures will occur. It's hard to imagine that you'd be able to design a system that is free of failures, right? Completely absent of failures over those types of timescales across, let's say, a population scale deployment. So hundreds of thousands of devices in patients, and they have to last 30, 40, 50 years. The idea that you would be able to do that without any device failures is probably totally unrealistic. And so I think redundancy is probably the way to go. So just as you would engineer a device to last 100 years, if the specification is to last for 50 years, you design the system with 5 sensors when you only need 2 sensors to work, that type of thing. So redundancy at that level. And we've already done that in certain instances. So for brain mapping devices that sit on the surface of the brain, you can only monitor electrical activity at a certain level of resolution. Yet we develop arrays that have densities that exceed that resolution. So we're kind of oversampling the spatiotemporal maps of electrical activity that we capture with those devices, so that if any unit cell within that array fails, it's no problem because we have working adjacent sensors that could be used to kind of fill in that gap. And I think that's probably the best way to do it. The other solution would be to design the system so that at least you know when it has failed, and that you can no longer trust the data from that particular sensor. And maybe in certain instances of superficial implants, it would afford an opportunity to surgically extract the device, repair it, or insert a new device. It's a little more primitive way to do things, and maybe you want to do both. You have redundancy, but you also have mechanisms for making a determination of when the device is not working anymore. And we actually did that in a simple example with these bioresorbable temporary pacemakers, in the sense that we have the implant that's doing the pacing, but then we also have a patch that mounts on the surface of the skin. It's delivering wireless power to the device and also controlling the pacing parameters, but it can also measure the cardiac response. And so if the heart is not effectively paced by the pacemaker, we know that because we're measuring the cardiac rhythm. We're also pacing the pacemaker, so we know what the rhythm should be. If it's not what the pacemaker is dictating, we know the pacemaker has failed. So different things of that sort can be embedded into the overall design, and I think it's probably extremely important to have that level of function integrated into how the overall system is operating.
So another point about the practicality, to have design something practical in this scope. When you look to what we do, maybe in research, do you think sometimes this thing doesn't really work because you have the experience for the commercial part? So when you try to design something and be practical and make sense, because sometimes, I don't know if you agree with that, sometimes the solution is not practical. Yes, it may be solve the problem, but it's not practical as a product. Do you have encountered something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of academic groups, there's a risk of that happening. That you end up working on something that ends up kind of being an academic curiosity, totally impractical. I got my career start at Bell Laboratories, and I think Bell Labs established almost an ideal model for how to do fundamental scientific research, but in the context of technology requirements that include operational stability, telecommunications, almost similar to the implants we're talking about. 25, 50-year lifetimes are typical, and addressing real requirements in cost and longevity and performance and so on. And so I guess we've tried to embed that kind of culture and that type of mindset into the academic programs that we have here in my group. Not quite as rigidly maybe as was done at Bell Labs, because the environment is different here and students have to be afforded an opportunity to make mistakes and do kind of dumb things as part of the learning process, and that's fine. And you need to allow for that. I think it's an important part of being a PhD student and learning how to do things. But we try to embed sort of practical engineering thinking into most of our programs. Not all. I mean, some of them are just open-ended, wild ideas, academic, trying to think about 3D, for example, and how to do integration. I'm not sure that'll work out, but it's something that, if it's happening anywhere, it should be happening at a university. That's the environment for that sort of thing. And I think it's important to have some component of your research in that kind of lunatic fringe type of space. But a lot of what we do, we aim, we set success metrics that are defined not by simply publishing a scientific paper in a competitive journal, but ultimately taking those ideas and deploying them in a meaningful way that could have broad societal impact. And so I can give you a specific example just to try to illustrate how this works. So we published a paper in spring 2019 in Science around a battery-free, wireless, kind of skin-like device platform that has the capability of ICU-grade clinical monitoring for premature babies, which are currently monitored by just really an awful rat's nest of wires and hard biosensors and adhesive tapes. Is really ill-suited for that patient population. It's something we started working on in 2015, published in 2019. So these are really fully epidermal or skin-like devices using all the design principles we talked about before. And we have ability to run them without batteries and in a continuous wireless fashion. And we've done probably 200 premature babies through our collaborations that we have here at Lurie Children's Hospital. No adverse events, and quantitatively correlated to clinical standards using the old wired-based approaches. And that was great. And we published those results in 2019. We were shortly thereafter contacted by program managers at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and with folks at the Save the Children organization asking whether we could take those technologies and put them in lower and middle income countries where there are no monitoring technologies at all. And so we began to think about that, and I guess we had that in the back of our mind, deployment, but that was a fairly challenging set of circumstances. How do you do it at the appropriate cost point? How you do it in devices that are sufficiently rugged and robust for use in these highly resource-constrained areas of the globe. And it really got us thinking about it and created a whole new set of really interesting engineering challenges that mapped quite nicely into academic efforts in engineering science. Like how do you do this kind of monitoring with those additional constraints layered on top? And so we were able to sort of take a step back and figure things out and put together, devices that met cost requirements and robustness in operation. And you have to do multiple cycles of use. It has to be reusable. Everything, all the monitors that are used, here in the U.S. in NICU facilities are single use. They're disposable. That's impossible, in Zambia, for example. You just can't support the economics associated with that. So we really have to think about reusable, rechargeable devices, fully wireless, totally encapsulated, waterproof, all this stuff. And so we're able to do that and publish the results in spring of 2020 in the journal Nature Medicine. And so those devices are now deployed at scale in Zambia, Kenya, Ghana, India, Pakistan, and Mexico through Save the Children organization and the Gates Foundation. So I think practical thinking and considerations around, how do you really do deployment economically? I think there are tremendously interesting academic, science-based questions that need to be answered to address those kinds of constraints and requirements. And I think it's the same type of thinking that led to, say, the invention of the transistor at Bell Laboratories. It wasn't a purely academic exercise around understanding how semiconductors operate, but it was really a directed effort to answer the question of how do we create a better switch that doesn't have reliability problems like vacuum tubes. And so I think that kind of push and pull between real world requirements and practical considerations and basic scientific research and engineering development, it creates a really rich environment and one that we've tried to reproduce here because I think it's also a great benefit to the students because many of them will end up with jobs in industry and they need to be thinking about a lot of these things. And so maybe that's one specific example that gets to your question.
Mm-hmm. That's really insightful. Yeah, maybe I'm curious about maybe what something do you think maybe it's still hard to understand or you think that's maybe, I wish that would be the future of the design for sensor for patient in that case. If you have this kind of futuristic vision for the design here.
Yeah, I mean, I think we like to think about engineering as a maybe dominant theme for how healthcare will be improved over time. And we have, a collection of sensors. This is a global effort, many academic groups, many companies working along these lines, not just us, obviously, but thinking about not just sensing, but also delivering therapies of various sorts. And maybe that could be electrical stimulation or mechanical perturbation or thermal therapy. Could involve, pharmacological approaches as well, but engineered vehicles for controlling pharmacokinetics and for releasing drugs on a time, a pre-programmed time scale. But I think the future is like combining sensing with actuation in a close feedback loop. So you have a device that's monitoring continuously organ health and then responding accordingly. So we have a very simple device, and you're beginning to see this begin to emerge in the context of treatment of epilepsy, for example, devices that monitor precursors to electrical activity that lead to seizures, and then stimulators that can eliminate that seizure before it ever happens, or devices that interface with the heart that can pick up very early signatures of a developing arrhythmia, and then stimulate the cardiac contractions and the cardiomyocytes in a way that eliminates the formation of that arrhythmia in the first place. So I think like a symbiotic integration of man-made systems with naturally occurring biological systems in a way that enhances and improves organ function, extends human life, I guess is maybe 20, 30, 40 year vision for how things might evolve in kind of a symbiotic way that blurs the distinction between technology and biology. These two systems are engineered to coexist in a way that has a benefit on human health. So I guess that's kind of the vision of like where we hope things will go in the future. And I think there are corresponding opportunities beyond just managing health status to brain-machine interfaces and sort of melding of the brain with artificial intelligence. And there are a lot of people thinking about that opportunity as well. But it really starts with hardware innovation and material science is my feeling, and that's kind of where our expertise is. But in realizing that longer term vision is something we're interested in.
The last question is, what could be the best advice was given to you and was life changing? Stick to your mind. Advice you received and was life changing advice.
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. One is everybody's different, and I think the hardest thing in developing a career is finding out what you're really good at and what you enjoy doing. And I think once you figure that out, then everything else, there's greatly enhanced clarity around choices and decisions that you make at various stages of your career. That's one thing is find what you're best at and kind of do that. And then for all the other stuff, develop a way to collaborate effectively. That's kind of been a hallmark of the way we've built our programs, is kind of understanding our core competencies and kind of focusing on that, and then understanding how to work effectively with others, to bring in, let's say, the mechanical engineering computational capability. We could potentially develop that ourselves, but why not work with a world expert and allow us to devote most of our bandwidth to what we're really good at. And similarly in clinical medicine, we don't know patient challenges and things. So you work with nurses, you work with physicians, or in neuroscience, you work with experts in those areas. So kind of understanding what you're good at, developing a deep competency in that space, but also kind of being able to communicate and engage with people who have expertise in adjacent areas. So almost like a T-shaped expertise profile, deep in one area, but then an ability to extend out and engage with others in other communities to kind of leverage your own capabilities with that of others. And I think that really enhances the scope of things that you can take on, the level of engineering challenges that you can tackle, and ultimately enhances your own productivity as well. So that would be kind of my main advice to maybe younger people who are trying to figure things out.
I don't know if you have any final words you'd like to say for closing. Any final words you'd like to say?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground. It was a great conversation. I appreciate that.
Thank you. So thank you once again for Sir John. It was really enjoyable, and I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.